This is Duke University.
Thank you so much, Pete, and also thank you to Antonio, Claudia, and Del, who made my visit here possible. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here at Duke, and if I'm shaking, a little nervous, I think that's a sign of my excitement. A nice way of getting out of it, right? So anyhow, I call this my midlife crisis book because what it is really is I'm going back to the music that I listened to growing up as a teenager, and there are also things that I took with me since that moment when I didn't know quite what to do with those historical nuggets, and I'm trying to make sense of them in a coherent way, and so this is an example of what I've been thinking about, so thank you for allowing me to test these ideas on you. So in her 2006 book, Maslandia, Morrissey Fans in the Borderlands, Chicana literature scholar Melissa Hidalgo tackles at the fore what has been identified by many journalists, filmmakers, and critics alike as the curious phenomenon that is the US Latino fandom of Stephen Patrick Morrissey, aka Morrissey or Maz, the former frontman of the British band The Smiths. Hidalgo explains, I wrote this book because I, along with many other Latina fans, got tired of the same old question of why we love Maz. The question of Latino and more specifically Mexican and Chicano Morrissey fandom and what have now become stock, if not cliched explanations, are useful starting points, and indeed they highlight important context for understanding this seemingly unlikely affinity. I am less interested in asking that question again and producing the same evidence to show that, yes, a lot of Mexicans, Latinos, Latinas, and Chicanos do, as do many other groups of people, love Morrissey. We all know these fans and communities exist, and it's not really so strange after all. Rather, I'm interested in asking the what and how questions, new questions that provide us with nuance, complexity, insight, and new ways to see, hear, and understand these fan communities in Los Angeles and around the Borderlands. Now, while I draw inspiration from Hidalgo in short-circuiting the why do Latinos love this kind of music or this particular band or singer question for the way it upholds a strange phenomenon evaluation, I part ways with her study given that I'm not only solely interested in fandom as the means for ascertaining the intimate attachments Latinos have to British bands and singers like Morrissey. Indeed, the project from which this talk draws, Latino UK, highlights the varied collaborations, physical convergences, and reciprocal influences of British post-punk music artists and Latino communities in the US from the 1980s onward, exploring the ways these seemingly disparate parties touch one another, aiming to map overlapping histories and cultures of working-class Latinas and Latinos and British singers and musicians of the late Cold War era. I try to make sense of how popular music helps facilitate and establish contact across the Atlantic divide. And as it's impossible for me not to also discuss Morrissey in this project, I suggest an alternative angle from which to appraise his movement and that of other music artists of his generation within Latino circles. As much as Morrissey has indeed touched Latino fans in numerous ways, as the burgeoning scholarship on the topic has insightfully shown, I argue that this influence has been mutual, and I therefore aim to illustrate how Latinos, fans, and otherwise have touched Morrissey. So the chapter that I'm writing on Morrissey isn't so much interested in the Latino fandom of Morrissey, but Morrissey's fandom of Latinos and how he's kind of come to LA, and there are all these rumors circulating about his sexual proclivities that include Latinos, and so I want to turn that narrative on its head. So queer studies scholar Karen Tongson has importantly commented on the way British popular music impacted youth of color, herself, as well as Latinos and Latinas among whom she grew up in Southern California. Her notion of remote intimacies, building on Jennifer Terry's early formulation of that concept, nicely captures the temporal discontinuities between fans in Southern California and the British pop music to which they are drawn. Now, Tongson writes, I've come to imagine remote intimacies describing the communities for whom intimacies cohere across virtual networks of desire through radio, music, and television, on the internet, and now through online and social networking sites. Remote intimacies account both technically and affectively for the symbiosis that can happen between disparate subjects, like the storied connections between Latinos and Morrissey, for example, or between suburban queer kids of color and Anglophilic ear candy in general. Now, Tongsen's articulation of remote intimacies effectively captures my own and many others, those suburban queer kids of color, attachment to many singers and bands from across the Atlantic. And while I hold on to Tongsen's insights, I further argue that the intimacies between Latinos and post-punk British artists were not resolutely remote, but also reciprocal. And indeed, remote intimacy is and is not the touching I'm identifying. That is, connections are sometimes made across misaligned times and spaces, but other times connections sync up and form unexpected social networks in shared times and locations. Furthermore, it is not only Latino fans who unilaterally possess or harbor such intimate attachments or feelings, remote or otherwise. I therefore find the idea of touch more advantageous for detailing the intimate bonds examined through this project. In her study titled Touch, Sensory Theory, and Multisensory Media, Laura U. Marks compels us to see how learning to, she says, appreciate the materiality of our media pulls us away from a symbolic understanding and toward a shared physical existence. That is, the material effects generated by the circulation of media and its makers enables a perspective for glimpsing the physical proximities of cultural producers and their audiences and mutual recognitions, even when temporal and spatial demarcations might manifest. Touch registers both the physical and psychic energies which haptically animate unbounded intimacies. I won't go on about that, but it kind of gives you a snapshot of the notion of touch that I'm working with. Okay, so this talk is also interspersed with some biographical anecdotes, and you have to let me know if they're too much. So it was a Saturday morning in February 1984. I was a 12-year-old kid, 1 month shy of entering my teenage years. You're probably wondering, how do you remember this stuff? I kind of have a memory like an elephant, which kind of works against me often. Anyway, so already feeling alienated from many of my peers, perhaps because I was beginning to experience a widening divide between us around our respective awakening sexual identities, I also found myself enduring the constant warring of parents who had fallen out of love years ago, but frequently and desperately attempted to stay together for their kids' sake. My mother was working long hours, including on weekends, struggling to make ends meet to support my sister and me after our father had decided to flee once again. And not wanting to leave us home alone, we were always dropped off at my Aunt Irene's apartment on weekends, where we would come equipped with an arsenal of books and art supplies to keep us busy until we were scooped up hours later. Yet on this particular morning, we walked into Irene's apartment at precisely what would prove to be a life-altering moment. Culture Club's Karma Chameleon, a song that I had recently become obsessed with, arose from the single speaker of a modest television set atop a stereo system. While the song seemingly greeted our arrival, what appeared on the screen assisted in further lodging the song at the center of my heart. The band's singer, who I soon came to know as Boy George, an androgynous figure capturing and holding my gaze for the duration of the video, profoundly moved me and influenced my lifelong relationship to popular music. Indeed, the song was the first in a long line of British pop songs that would touch me in ways both intellectual and affective. Now, my introduction to the post-punk scene, and I kind of use that term capaciously, was certainly enabled by music video and concerts, where my dad worked security and would sneak my sister and I into the shows, and we would sit in the lawn way in the back, but we were still there. But also the print media of the time that provided the information on who these fabulously made-up creatures were and what made them tick. And my discovery of Star Hits magazine at the local supermarket opened up new vistas. For not only did it provide a wealth of information about a growing list of British pop stars I found myself obsessing over, but it also served as a study guide for discovering artists, writers, philosophers, and earlier musicians like Roxy Music, who compelled me not to only do well in school, but also set me on the path toward an academic career. Now, fittingly, Boy George's face was on the cover of the first issue of Star Hits I would purchase. Soon after I discovered Star Hits, its older sister publication from across the Atlantic, Smash Hits, came into my life. And while it might mean something that Boy George was also on the cover of the first issue of Smash Hits that I'd own, it was an interview inside the July-August 1984 issue with former Sex Pistols and after Public Image Limited singer John Lydon, previously known as Johnny Rotten, that would profoundly impact me just like the Culture Club video. Interviewer Peter Martin, after asking Lydon what people think of him in America after his move to Los Angeles, poses a follow-up question. Apart from getting together a new band, what have you been up to out there? Lydon responds, I hang around with the Chicanos, and the editor provides an explanation of who Chicanos are, Mexicans who live in America, who are into all that cruising around in 50s cars. I've got a 57 Caddy Cadillac. I got it for $2,000, V8 engine, the works. I've had it souped up, so I'm going into races now. Some serious stock car stuff. I love it. There was this interview with Lydon that stuck with me during my teenage years when I was told this music was not for me. Whether it was the aggression experienced at concerts, recalling the racism directed at Mexican-American patrons at an X concert in Bret Easton Ellis's 1985 novel Less Than Zero, or when in Depeche Mode's documentary 101 about their historic concert at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, in which a white kid calls brown kids posers to regulate their claims to music incompatibility with a culture to which they should naturally be consigned, musical tastes were often delineated in racially segregated ways. As much as recent commentators like to argue that Latinos were present in alternative music scenes of this era, that information doesn't retract from the fact that I and many others had been made to believe that we weren't able to claim this music by both white and Latino peers alike. Now, this one sentence spoken by Lydon, onto which I've held on tightly, also charges the inspiration to circle back to this era to consider the transatlantic connections that manifested in myriad ways and mark a politics of dialogic exchange that may perhaps serve as well, may perhaps serve us well at this historical moment in which renewed threats of global violence recall the late Cold War era, 1980s of my teen years, nuclear war. So what is post-punk, and does Culture Club, who I just mentioned, qualify as post-punk, not to mention those artists whose connections to punk might appear as something of a stretch? I argue they do, especially in spite of what the title of music critic David Rimmer's book, Like Punk Never Happened, Culture Club and the New Pop, suggests. In her classic work, Feminism and Youth Culture, From Jackie to Just 17, cultural studies scholar Angela McRoby identifies, she says, Boy George as a key figure in the post-punk to pop crossover. Yet as Boy George and Culture Club, particularly drummer John Moss, who was briefly a member of the influential punk band The Damned, were both inspired by the punk movement, with George often citing Susie Sue, who emerged from the original punk scene and who I'll soon discuss, and formative in cultivating the new romantic Blitz kid scene that arguably took the torch of its predecessors for establishing an alternative milieu for marginalized come empowered youth. Public Image Limited is oftentimes seen as the penultimate post-punk band, whereas Culture Club is kind of seen as this flimsy pop group. And even Lydon said in an interview that if it wasn't for punk, a group like Culture Club couldn't exist. So there's a really strong connection between those two that I take seriously. And also, let me just say that the cultural studies work that I was introduced to by Professor James Clifford during graduate school has been really, really, really important for this project. The work of Stuart Hall on his work on Thatcherism, as well as McRoby and the scholars who are writing about youth cultures in Britain, has been really beneficial. For example, so what McRoby writes about Culture Club and other groups that hit it big in the early 80s, particularly in light of their appearance in magazines like Star Hits and Smash Hits, resonates for me as in thinking about my musical interest as a queer Chicano kid. For McRoby, the era served as a moment when artists producing pure pop, as she puts it, had the potential to be subversively popular instead of being critical or radical from miles out on the fringes of the independent scene. McRoby writes, there was a moment at the tail end of punk when these musical energies were redirected back towards the sector of the music industry, which was most despised by serious musicians. And I'm thinking here of Licia's work on pop, and as you said, it's oftentimes maligned, and also I think it's really important to move pop, as you said, out of its local context and to think about it more on a global stage. This was a market which consisted of a female rather than male audience. The new attitude on the part of those bands and musicians whose interests were turning profits to be made from the pocket money of 13-year-olds as a result of soft, soulful pop tunes and heartthrob good looks. And she says Wham were the best example, with a new commitment to the pop mainstream. She continues, there was a kind of camp splendor about having thousands of girls screaming and crying and setting up fan clubs up and down the country. Now, in his foreword to the 2006 book, The Best of Smash Hits, the 80s, former Smash Hits editor turned Pet Shop Boy Neil Tennant writes, I was lucky enough to work for Smash Hits in a golden age of British pop, between the end of punk and Live Aid. This was the period when young, intelligent pop stars had learned the lessons and ideas of punk and decided to link them to the glamour of pop stardom in nightlife. A stylish, thoughtful, hedonistic pop era flourished, and Smash Hits was its house magazine. Now, despite the disdain for the colorful and glossy smash hits by the supposedly more sophisticated music publications in circulation at the time, smash hits had a form and function that the others could only wish to have. Tennant explains, to realize what made smash hits special, you had to be aware of the competition. New Musical Express, Melody Maker, and Sounds, weekly newspapers whose styles ranged from the faux intellectual and leading music criticism. In those days, we used to call them rockist, an ultimate term of abuse. Actually, from our Carnaby Street offices, we would look right into those of NME across the road and mock their failing circulation. Now, I learned a great deal about politics, British and American, from the pages of Smash Hits and its US sister publication, Star Hits, working class struggles like Red Wedge, racism, Rock Against Racism, and an emergent discourse of gender and sexuality that unquestionably fed into my embrace of queer theory. Recall, for example, Eve Sedgwick's 1996 essay, Gosh, Boy George, you must be awfully secure in your masculinity. Although punk is often heralded as clearing space for the resistance to the powers that be, the gendered alternatives offered by post-punk British popular music is unparalleled. And while the 1980s unquestionably fomented an unparalleled moment of conservatism, it was also a time of subversively queer possibility. This was true for both youth in the US and the UK, and in the United States, British music also represented an alternative to the American mainstream music scene that regularly propped up the straight macho posturing of male-fronted hard rock bands. I won't talk about them, but I just wanted to briefly mention two people, the first of whom is Suzanne Colon, who was the associate editor of Star Hits. I've had the chance to talk to Suzanne, and she talks about how she was a fan of Smash Hits. She's Puerto Rican, Jewish from New York, and when she found out about Star Hits, she was calling the editors constantly to ask about an internship and pestered them enough so that they finally gave her an internship. A few years later, she would become the associate editor of the magazine and would go on to interview a good number of the pop stars that they would feature in the magazine. And then the second person is Mundo Mesa, who is the subject of the recent exhibition for the catalog. Josh and I we co-write. We wrote essays for the catalog, but Mundo was in a relationship with fashion maven Simon Doonan and a number of people who were part of the new romantic scene, like Pinky Tessa Braithwaite and Marilyn, who was Boy George's nemesis, moved to LA, and they would hang out with these Chicano kids and recreate the new romantic scene in Los Angeles. Okay, so one of the many bands I was introduced to in the pages of Star Hits and Smash Hits was Susie and the Banshees, to whom I now wish to direct our attention. So in the introduction to their 2007 anthology, Goth, editors Lauren Goodlad and Michael Bibby provide their reader with a familiar narrative about Susie Sue of Susie and the Banshees and their contribution to what they painstakingly describe as transnational goth subculture. Let me just read a passage that gives you a good sense of how they describe it. So goth subculture emerged in the socioeconomic decline and Thatcherite politics of late 1970s Britain on the heels of punk's infamous rebellion. Drawing on diverse fringe cultures from Dada to garage rock, punk had catalyzed a generation of youth with its DIY attitude toward music, fashion, preference for safety pins and thrift shops, and contempt for mass-marketed music culture. By the late 1970s, punk was itself being exploited for commercial potential, yet punk also had energized a surge of new styles such as new romantic, industrial, new wave, and hardcore. Amid this dizzying subcultural effulgence, a number of bands and personalities began cultivating what would soon become known as goth. Now, immediately following this historical account of goth's emergence, Goodlad and Bibby identify Susie Sue as one of goth's founding figures. They tell us Sue, who began her career as a gothic doyenne in the Sex Pistols scene, helped to popularize a look characterized by deathly parlor, dark makeup, Weimar-era decadence, and Nazi chic. Yet they also fail to mention that Susie was the only woman lead singer from this original group of bands that had of that particular punk moment. However, on numerous occasions, Sue and Banshee's bassist Steve Severin have commented on their association with Goth, oftentimes referring to it as Goth with two Fs, to signal a cliched phenomenon that has flattened rather than highlighted the nuances underscoring the band's music. Mark Patris's authorized biography of the Banshees declares, Gothic, in its purest sense, is actually a very powerful, twisted genre, but the way it was being used by journalists, Goth with a double F, always seemed to me to be about tacky harem scarum horror, and I find that anything but scary. That was what we were all about. There was something hippie about it too. Juju, their fourth album, was perhaps, or did have a horror theme to it, but it was psychological horror, nothing to do with ghosts and ghouls. Now, Severin admits that the band had described Juju as Gothic upon the album's release, but he notes that journalists had not picked up on or immediately classified the music and the band as such, and Sue clarifies that the strong identity of Juju was diluted by the goth bands that came in their wake and tried to mimic them. And she says they were using horror as the basis for stupid rock and roll pantomime. Now, in this discussion of Juju and its contested Gothic impulses is what I find most revealing, Severin's follow-up confession. If there was a band that influenced what we did on Juju, it was the Cramps. Not musically, because they were much more rooted in straightforward rock and roll, but in terms of some of their imagery and the way it came across. The Cramps, nowhere discussed in Good Lad and Bibby's book, let alone in the introduction, which includes a curious selection of black and white photos of Depeche Mode, David Bowie, and Sid and Nancy, and Emily the Strange. We're an American punk band formed in Akron, Ohio, that moved to New York and then relocated to Los Angeles in 1980, the same year that Susie and the Banshees first toured the United States. Now, I won't discuss the complementary aesthetics between the Cramps and the Banshees. I do want to highlight the connection between the two bands as a moment in which musicians from the UK come in contact with Latinos in the US. The Banshees' connection to the Cramp signals the way the former band strikingly disidentifies, of course, in relation to Jose Munoz's work, which I'll talk about in a little bit, with the latter, in that the Cramps, who as we now know tend to be classified as goth, became a source for fueling a Gothic impulse, not based on their music, but on their imagery. Part of this, I suggest, is the disidentification between the two bands by way of the connection established between Susie Sue and the Cramps' guitarist, Kid Congo Powers. In 1980, the year of the Banshees' first US tour, as previously noted, Kid, née Brian Tristan, a second-generation Mexican-American born in La Puente, California, joined the Cramps to replace Brian Gregory on guitar, named by Cramps members Poison Ivy and Lux Interior from a Santeria candle on which was written, "When you light this candle, Congo Powers will be revealed to you," with Tristan adding Kid because he thought it sounded like a boxer or a pirate. Kid Congo Powers remained with the band until September 1983. In a detailed and illuminating online oral history, Kid explains the beginning and the continuation of his relationship with Susie and the Banshees during his membership with the Cramps, the Gun Club, which is the LA-based country or cowpunk or post-punk band, and For Bible, a collaborative endeavor with Patricia Morrison, the founding member of the Bags, and drummer Desperate. And this is Kid Congo Powers. We'd been friends with Susie for a long time. I had actually met her and the Banshees when I was in the Cramps, and we did some shows together. And I befriended them. That's another really great story when Kid Congo Powers takes Susie to Disneyland for the first time, and the employees at Disneyland are horrified. They don't know what to do with her. Billy Holston, who was their assistant right-hand man, he's the guy who made the Fur Bible cover, the artwork on that. He was the champion of our band, and he suggested it to them. And the Gun Club had played some shows with the Banshees as well, and they were big fans of the Gun Club. And so they asked us to go on tour with them, and of course we said yes, and that was all good because they were really popular at the time. We played at the Royal Albert Hall where Bob Dylan played, and we played big theaters everywhere in England. I guess we went over okay, I don't remember. Now, after the Gun Club split in 1984, Fur Bible lent their support to the Banshees, and from their reformation 2 years later in 1986 until her final days in 1996, Susie remained a fan and friend to both the band and Kid Congo Powers. Given the history of Sue's status as social outcast and the alliances she established with other outsiders, the bond between the two makes sense not only with respect to their mutual admiration as artists, but also based on a reciprocal admiration between a Chicano gay man and a woman fronting an all-male band in a mostly male music scene. Now, I was thinking that there were a lot of different talks I could give today, but I decided on this one because on August 11, 2002, I was lucky enough to see Susie and the Banshees live with Pete Siegel before the band officially called it quits. The show was part of their 7-year Itch tour, and it was thrilling to finally see them in concert after a few failed attempts years before. To my great surprise, the band's opening act was none other than artist and singer, to name only two of her many roles, Vaginal Davis. My familiarity with Davis was facilitated by Jose Munoz, who forcefully and elegantly wrote about her terrorist drag. At first, I was surprised to discover that Davis was the Banshees' opening act, but upon reflection, it made perfect sense, given Susie's familiarity with key figures in LA's punk and post-punk scene. The offspring of a Mexican-American father who was 20 years old when he met only once his 45-year-old Black Creole mother, Davis is as blunt as she is thoroughly detailed. And I won't read an excerpt from her mid-August 2002 blog, but she writes about how much she admires Susie. The relationship between Davis and Sue and drummer Budgie pivots on their capacity to disidentify with one another, and the Banshees' invitation to Davis to open for them at the Hollywood Palladium, where Davis was conceived under a table, highlights a long-standing appreciation for queer Latino American artists. And here we can think of not only the Cramps and Vaginal Davis, but also Dave Navarro, the Chicano guitarist, while a member of Jane's Addiction, toured with the Banshees during the inaugural Lollapalooza and claims to have made out with Severin and slept with Sue. So it's just a bunch of gossip, really. But historically relevant. I also want to consider the connections between Susie and her US Latino fans, namely Susie's ability to touch these fans in distinct ways. For example, consider an episode of Request Video, a music video program broadcast from Southern California and hosted by KROQ DJ Jim the Poor Man Trenton, featuring Susie and Budgie. This episode, shot during 1990 during the Creatures and Offshoot Banshees project tour for their second album, Boomerang, includes not only a rather extensive interview with Susie and Budgie, but it additionally introduces the winner of a contest to meet the band, with Request Video receiving over 1,400 letters for the chance to meet the duo, with the winner allowed to bring along a friend. The winning letter was submitted by a young Latino named Martin, along with Martin and his Aunt Myra, identified as a Susie fanatic. Martin is somewhat indifferent about the encounter, although he could be playing it cool, despite the fact that his question to Susie and Budgie about their favorite place to play concerts is somewhat underwhelming. Myra, however, is evidently elated and asks an intriguing question about the influence of world events on Susie's songwriting, particularly with regard to the Creatures' song Man-Child. Susie then provides a detailed account of the inspiration for the song, a young Colombian boy named Nelsito, marked for death at the age of 18, but assassinated sooner as a result of being caught in the crossfire of a drug cartel-inspired feud. The exchange between Susie and Budgie and Martin and Myra, not necessarily mediated by the poor man, is quite touching, especially when one watches other interviews with Susie in which she clearly despises her interview or visibly wishes she was elsewhere. But more intriguing is when Susie jumps out of her seat, lunges at Martin, and touches him all over, thus asserting an intimate encounter with the winner who only submitted one letter. I was going to play you a clip from this video, but there are some screenshots from it. In Junot Diaz's 2007 book novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, the reader is introduced to Lola, the book's eponymously named protagonist's sister, as a young Dominican woman whose musical and aesthetic sensibilities clash with others around her. She's ridiculed for defying the cultural codes assumed for a Paterson, New Jersey Latina. In Lola's words, a punk chick, that's what I became, a Susie and the Banshees loving punk chick drawn here by Love and Rockets artist Jaime Hernandez. The Puerto Rican kids on the block couldn't stop laughing when they saw my hair. They called me Blackula. And the Morenos, they didn't know what to say. They just called me devil bitch. Yo, devil bitch, yo, yo. And on the other coast, we have Chicanas like Sandy, represented in Chicana Japanese-American artist Shizu Saldamondo's 2007 piece, Sandy and Susie. Now, Lola and Sandy are clearly not the rich white surfer kids in Southern California who believe that bands like Susie and the Banshees belong to them, as I was repeatedly told growing up in Orange County, California. They are also not the Californians who, according to Budgie and Petrus's biography, look terrible. These were, as Budgie puts it, the ones who were trying to be punks but were just spoiled rich kids wearing bin liners and safety pins. They'd pretend they were really into us, then when we'd meet them, they'd say, "Hey guys, want to come to the beach with us tomorrow? We can score some grass." Terrible people. Rather, like Martin and Myra, Lola and Sandy are touched by Susie, drawing influence from her as an example to navigate the normative terrain, even in those spaces misidentified as alternative. Now, following the path of Latinas and Latinos touched by Susie, I close this paper with a story that predates my attendance at the Banshees Hollywood Palladium show with Pete. In 1994, I took time off from graduate school thinking I'd go back to, thinking I was going to drop out after becoming disillusioned with my graduate program. I moved back to Santa Ana from Santa Cruz to live with my grandparents and could not pick up a book after having something of a nervous breakdown. Alex, my best friend at the time, or my best friend in high school, called me one evening to invite me out to a club in Hollywood. And I knew he had a growing interest in fetish, but I didn't realize that our destination was a fetish club. This club, Cinematic, which Jennifer Doyle writes about in her book, Hold It Against Me in relation to Ron Athey, was admittedly more traumatic than enticing. Unfazed by the flesh spilling from assless leather chaps and the men and women bound and gagged or being walked on dog leashes, I was more perplexed by the streams of blood induced by various acts of volenophilia on stage. Unable to look away, I did at one point glance to my left at the person who had touched me or brushed up against me, and in doing so, I found myself staring into the eyes of Susie Sue, who stood alongside Budgie. I didn't say anything, but I nodded. She nodded back. And I often wonder what she would have said to me had I introduced myself. But that moment was more than enough. Susie had not only physically touched me for a split second, but she touched me with her singing voice along with her company in quite the unexpected place. Sue, nay Susan Janet Balian, had revealed that she chose her stage name as a result of her identification with the Indians over the cowboys in Western films. And akin to Jose Muñoz's now classic formulation that finds one disidentifying with, for example, mass-mediated images that on the surface may seem damaged and damaging, Susie's association with Indians should not be read as an appropriation of indigeneity as much as it is a disidentification with the underdog. The televisually and cinematically vilified images of Indians who must, in the conventional order of things, be defeated by cowboys. And it was interesting that Richard Rodriguez had expressed his fancy, he'd fancied the Indians as well. Which didn't surprise us, right? Because it was like, yeah, we know. This is also not unlike Muñoz's reading of Germ's frontman Darby Crash, whose visit to the Los Angeles-based Atomic Cafe entailed a blessing of Chicano punk. As Muñoz writes, Crash's blessing means a lot to the Chicano punks. Crash, as I mentioned above, went on to record saying some stupid things about fascism that I don't want to simply dismiss as merely punk posturing. It is therefore interesting that despite his ignorant provocations, he represented a version of punk rock that so many kids with less stuff, and by this I mean fewer life chances, could really relate to. But again, this essay has not been so much about the biographical Darby Crash as it has been about the figure of Darby Crash in all its contradictions and incommensurability. Susie, as Muñoz says about Crash, is a figure that invites certain allegiances, a fandom, a sense of plurality, that being in common that so many who are without crave. Susie's repertoire of connections and her status as a figure for initiating significant allegiances for and between her Latino fans and fellow artists hold great promise for charting networks and affiliations, a being in commonness that are at once oral and sensorial. Indeed, the capacity to touch one another across divides and within shared places is what compels this project for the way in which I find myself reveling in the popular, or once popular, as a means for thinking about transatlantic intimacies made then, now, and quite possibly for the future. Thank you.